All right, so today we're going to look at the historical overview of Hinduism, talk a little bit about how and when and where in the world it started, and some of the major developments or stages that it's gone through. So, as I mentioned before, Hinduism is the oldest of the religious traditions that we're going to look at, and it dates back to the Indus Valley civilization. As you'll see for Hinduism, there's not necessarily a single founder or a single point in time that we can pinpoint when exactly Hinduism started because it's simply so ancient. It's been practiced for so long. Once we move into Buddhism and some of the subsequent religious traditions, we can much more easily pinpoint, this is exactly when it started and exactly who it started with. With Hinduism, it's more of a collection of circumstances that we know about that we think gave rise to what Hinduism is today. So, the first layer of that history is the Indus Valley civilization. And this was a civilization that existed on the Indian subcontinent, so what is today India and Pakistan. And this civilization dates back to 2750 BCE. So it's an incredibly ancient community and ancient culture and civilization that existed on the Indian subcontinent. And actually, we didn't know that much about these people until only about 100 years ago. In the early 1900s, two major sites were found that are known as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These are cities that are in present-day Pakistan. The image that you can see here, this is actually of one of those sites. And basically, these whole cities were uncovered by archaeologists in the early 20th century. These two cities were much larger and much more sophisticated than historians thought about the Indus Valley civilization. There were thousands of people living together in these communities. And as you can see from the image here, you see the lines here. There was irrigation, there was sewage, there was city planning. It was an incredibly advanced civilization for that time. So the first layer of Hinduism goes back to this community that we call the Indus Valley civilization. And the Indus Valley civilization did have a religious tradition. We don't know that much about it, and sometimes it's referred to as a proto-Hinduism because there do seem to be some similarities between what Hinduism has become today and what the religious tradition was practiced by the Indus Valley civilization, by the Indus Valley people. We don't know that much about it because even though they did have a written language and we found artifacts with that language on it, no one's been able to decipher that language yet. So it's a pictographic language similar to hieroglyphics, and we just don't know what any of this stuff says because no one has been able to translate it because this is a language that died out a long, long time ago. But there are written pieces of information. And there have been figurines that have been found at these two sites, at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, that look similar to some of the Hindu gods today. So they're little sort of clay dolls, clay figurines that look similar to some of the Hindu gods and goddesses that we're going to be introduced to in this unit. So there was something that looked like Hinduism that was being practiced by this community as far back as 2750 BCE. The second layer that sort of adds to the conditions that created Hinduism is this people known as the Aryans. The Aryans, the word Aryan is probably one that you know for very different reasons today. When you hear the word Aryan, you probably think of white supremacy, Aryan nationalists, white nationalists, folks like that. However, the term, of course, has been hijacked and misused by those communities. What they think of as the Aryans is really not historical at all. It's not correct. It's not true. So it's important to know that this is a term that does relate to a group of people, but what historians and archaeologists actually think about this term and where it came from. So there was a group of people known as the Aryans, and we don't know exactly where they came from, but most likely they originated somewhere in Central Asia, somewhere near maybe Iran, Afghanistan, somewhere around there. We don't know exactly who these people were or exactly where they came from. But this group of people, we know, started to migrate down into the Indian subcontinent, started to move down into the Indian subcontinent. And we know that they came down there because of the language that they brought with them. They brought a language with them known as Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, meaning that it has connections to European languages and it has connections to languages spoken in the Indian subcontinent. So the Aryans, wherever they came from, moved south, moved down into India, and they started to merge with the Indus Valley civilization. So these two cultures started coming together, Aryan culture and the Indus Valley culture. We know that there was this migration, and that eventually Aryan culture took some sort of dominance in the Indian subcontinent because they brought the language Sanskrit with them, and Sanskrit is the sacred language of Hinduism today. So in some ways, the culture and the language that they brought with them became the dominant language in the Indian subcontinent. Because it does have connections to European languages, this is where you sort of get that false mythology by Aryan nationalists and white nationalists that this is some sort of ancient, supreme, pure race, and that's who Europeans are descended from. There is no historical or archaeological evidence to back that up. The Aryans were a people that lived somewhere in Asia and moved down into the Indian subcontinent. That's what we know about whoever these Aryan people were. So eventually these two cultures mixed, and from that mixture of cultures, we get Hinduism. There are theories that the Aryans were a monotheistic tradition, that they likely worshipped one supreme god. And this is where this sort of balance that we talked about already comes from, the balance of the oneness and the many, the unity and the diversity that exists within Hinduism. That balance that is kept very much intact within Hinduism may be because the tradition itself emerged from the mingling of these two cultures. That the Indus Valley civilization was likely a polytheistic culture because of the existence of these figurines, and that the Aryans were likely a monotheistic culture. And when the two came together and Hinduism emerges from those two cultures, that's why we get a tradition that is so diverse and seems to emphasize both a unity and a diversity, a one and a many. But these are, of course, theories. It's such an ancient tradition that the best we can do is look at the archaeological evidence, the historical evidence, and try to make our best guesses. So the next layer of history that we have in terms of coming to Hinduism today are the texts known as the Vedas, and from that, the religion that emerges, which is today known as Vedic religion. So in terms of a beginning point of Hinduism, because we don't know exactly when that happened, what historians of religion look to is the earliest copies of the Vedas. So the Vedas are the most sacred text in Hinduism. They're the most sacred scripture in Hinduism. And they date back to around 1500 BCE. And they're written in Sanskrit. This is why historians think that in some way Aryan culture kind of won out, because the written language that existed before then is no longer in use, right? It's a dead language that no one can translate today. It's the Sanskrit language, the language the Aryans brought with them, that becomes the dominant language, the sacred language of Hinduism. So the Vedas they're not a single text. It's not like the Bible or the Quran. The Vedas are actually a vast collection of texts. So Hinduism doesn't have one sacred text. It has several sacred texts, which we'll look at over the course of this unit. But the Vedas are definitely the most important. They are the most sacred text in Hinduism, and despite the diversity of beliefs and understandings about what Hinduism is, the Vedas are often used as sort of a litmus test of who is or is not Hindu. If someone sees the Vedas as a sacred text, even if they haven't read much of the Vedas, they haven't studied them that much, then they could be considered a Hindu. Even if they have very different beliefs from other Hindus, if they look to the Vedas as a sacred text, then they could be considered a Hindu. So as I mentioned, they originate with the earliest copy we have of them, comes from around 1500 BCE, although very likely the stories and the information, the content of the Vedas goes back much farther. With all religious sacred texts, usually these stories are told orally, are passed down by word of mouth for generations, hundreds of years, before they're actually written down in texts. And the Vedas, we're going to read, you're going to read some passages from the Vedas in the world's wisdom text, so you'll get an idea of what these texts are like. They contain hymns, they have chants, they talk about the different gods, they have instructions for rituals, they have mythology. It's really a collection of a lot of different types of writing that has to do with Hinduism. And the interesting thing about the Vedas is that even though they're the most sacred text, they're the most important text, they're actually the least widely read. Most Hindus have not read much of the Vedas. The Vedas are difficult texts to read. It's not an easy read. There's not a lot of storytelling in them. They tend to focus on prayers, hymns, chants, and instructions for rituals that are not necessarily performed anymore. So for most Hindus, even if they view the Vedas as a sacred text, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've studied them or read them very much. There are other texts in Hinduism which are much more popular and much more widely read. So the Vedas are an important text to know. They're an important text to see a glimpse of, and to know that they are sort of this unifying factor and this sort of beginning point for Hinduism. But they're not that popular in terms of just, an average Hindu individual and how much of the Vedas they've read. But from the Vedas, we get what is termed Vedic religion. And Vedic religion is a bit different from what we could say modern Hinduism is today, and Prothero talks about this, because the Vedas talk a lot about certain rituals and certain gods. And a lot of those rituals are no longer performed, and a lot of those gods are no longer worshipped. So it's also a text that is a little out of date in terms of what Hinduism has become today. Vedic religion very much centered on rituals to the gods, and those rituals could only be performed by priests. Oftentimes they could only be participated in or afforded by the top caste, which we'll talk more about. We'll talk about the caste system, which are the Brahmins, the Brahmin caste. So it's a tradition that was very popular in India for a long time, but because it was inaccessible to a lot of people in the Indian subcontinent, a lot of people who were from a lower caste or couldn't afford to be a part of these rituals, didn't have the literacy to read the Vedas, it's something that was sort of reserved for the elite. It was reserved for the elite in Indian society, but it's based around this text, the Vedas. So that has sort of given rise to what we call philosophical Hinduism, which draws with it the instructions and the ideas from the Vedas, but adds another layer on top of that, which is the text of the Upanishads. So a later sacred text that was written later than the Vedas are the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are another group of texts that we're going to read from, that some of your sections from the world's wisdom text are from the Upanishads. But the Upanishads were really a text that responded to the fact that the Vedic religion was really just for the elites in society. It was for the top caste, it was for the wealthy. So for the majority of Hindus, there was a spirituality that was missing. There was a personal devotional aspect of Hinduism that was missing because the tradition was so ritualistic. So the Upanishads are much more philosophical, hence we call it philosophical Hinduism. And it talks much more about a personal soul, which we'll talk about, known as the Atman, and how one can come to understand one's soul and connect one's soul to God. So that is sort of the central theme in the Upanishads. It's a much more accessible text. It's a much more readable text. And it's something that is not as elitist, so everyone could sort of understand this and practice and be a part of this form of Hinduism. And again, this is not to say that each stage, is no longer practiced. These are just all the historical layers that have gone into modern Hinduism today. So the Upanishads date from a bit after the Vedas. They're more about the year 1000 BCE. I won't test you on the exact dates, but they are a bit more recent than the Vedas. So we have all of these sort of fragments, all of these strings that are coming into Hinduism today. And then, of course, we'll also talk about devotional Hinduism, which is much more popular in Hinduism today. But it all works together. It's all part of this tradition that we call Hinduism today. So today there's about 1 billion Hindus in the world. It's the third largest religious tradition in the world, and of the ones that we'll be studying. The most popular religious tradition in the world is Christianity. Almost 1 in 3 people in the world are Christian. After that is Islam, and then the third is Hinduism. Hinduism does still have very strong connections to the country of India. India is a majority Hindu country, but there are, of course, Hindus that live all over the world today. So it's a very sizable religious tradition. And as we mentioned today, it is a religious tradition that incorporates a lot of different beliefs and a lot of different practices. So as we go through these different practices, you can see how there are aspects from Vedic religion in Hinduism today. There are aspects from philosophical Hinduism. And there are aspects from what Prothero calls devotional Hinduism. And Hinduism absorbs them all. Hinduism is large enough and accommodating enough to see all of those different ways of being Hindu as part of this one system, as part of this one tradition. So as we'll see, there are many different ways of being Hindu. There are many different ways of practicing Hinduism. It's a very diverse religious tradition because it has this multi-layered history, because it has all of these different aspects incorporated into it. Beliefs from the Indus Valley civilization, from the Aryan people, from the Vedas, from the Upanishads, as we'll see from other texts that focus on certain gods and devotion to gods. So this all goes into the different ways of being Hindu today. So now we'll move on to myths and talk about what some of those beliefs are.